Hey guys, how are you?
Hi.
Yeah, good.
Very well, thank you.
It's really good to see you, and I'm excited to be celebrating your new book, which is just out, Wild Time. Before we turn to the book, could I ask you to introduce yourselves, please?
Yeah, I'm Rose. Hi. So I'm a writer of short fiction and now, of course, novel-length fiction. I'm also an academic of immersive and interactive performance primarily, and I work in theatre and performance, jobbing, I guess, sometimes as a playwright, sometimes as a performer, sometimes as a deviser, sometimes as a pole dancer across various theatre and sometimes circusy contexts.
Great, thank you.
I'm Keir. Hi. I work in the arts, in theatre, music, writing, and often with collaboration, but not exclusively. My background's visual design and playing and writing for bands, but I found myself working in a theatrical context for the most part, mainly because they can pull from any of those strands, I suppose. I suppose I often enjoy working with adaptation and kind of punk as a philosophy rather than a sonic genre. Mm-hmm. Humor and work that's kind of stretching a bit, like slightly risky stuff, perhaps.
Great.
Yeah, like big decisions, right? Like there's a lot of your shows have a.
That's the attempt anyway.
Yeah.
And have a moment of, I feel like there was a phrase almost coming there, and I'm interested to know what it was. So kind of risk taking. Is it a moment of pausing and allowing the audience to have an agency that you can't predict, or?
I think it depends on the project, but I feel like there's usually an element of looking to kind of shoot a bit further than will necessarily land. And as I say that, I think, why on earth would that be a choice? But I suppose that there's a mischief and a cheekiness that I feel like is a helpful tool when making some work.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And would you mind also introducing the novel, Wild Time? What does our audience need to know about it in order for them to follow the conversation we're about to have?
We like to say it's for the lovers and the haters. It's a novel. It's a theatrical novel that's in conversation with A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's a sort of, I want to say reimagining, but it's a sort of
a revision kind of A Midsummer Night's Dream. But yeah, I think that we're loyal to having the same characters, at least by name, and we follow the plot in some ways kind of closely, but well, you know, there's big questions raised in the 21st century from that context about the content, and so we think that we've tried to address a lot of that and have a big conversation with that text. So that if you are not a fan of A Midsummer Night's Dream, potentially
it's also also fun. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely is. I absolutely loved reading it, and congratulations on such an exciting text. I won't quite say anything more just yet about that because I kind of want to tease more content out of you. But Keir, you referred to the kind of 21st century issues that we might have with the story. Do you mind telling us a bit more, either of you, about those issues?
I suppose fundamentally when this novel project kind of started, I was interested in kind of riffing on the idea of Titania somehow. And the sort of headline of what happens to her as a character is a story of coercion and top-down power, and, you know, a character arriving on stage with the most status I think is possible. But she doesn't really have a lot, in my opinion, to do, or she's brought down or put in her place quite quickly. That sort of is the trajectory of her story overwhelmingly, I find. So I suppose what we wanted to do with this book was not tell another story like that, but to see what what we could change and what the effect of changing that would be.
Yeah, I suppose, as probably with a great many texts, though this is a particular example of what I'm about to say, there are all sorts of kind of gender issues and coercion issues within this work. And I mean, from what I hear, when Shakespeare was writing it, perhaps that was what he might have been looking at in some ways. And that's all well and good. But when, you know, Rose was writing a story about Titania, we thought, well, I think originally, because Rose wrote the first draft on her own, originally the idea was to do like a Noises Off style, what would Titania do in the scenes where she's not on, and try and fit a second story around that first one. And when we read that draft through together, we were finding that we were having to do all sorts of acrobatics and dances just to kind of give her the agency that we wanted to give her in our story. And the best solution that we could find, the one we went with, was to actually just go ahead and make the changes of the original that we wished to. And that opened up a whole world of things to explore from then on, if that answers some of your question.
Yeah, it does. And the book is really successful in recentering Titania, whether she's on or off stage, in the plot that Shakespeare gives us, and inviting the reader to hang out in her boudoir, or whatever the right word is, in her court, in her location, and recentering our viewpoint, I suppose, of this story from the position of Titania and her entourage. Yeah, I guess I feel I should say, for listeners who don't know the Shakespeare play, that it's I think it is still the most commonly performed play in primary schools across the globe, which is a horrifying thought, and so often sold to us as a play about love. But as so often when Western culture talks about love, what it's usually talking about is sex, and that notion that Rose raised of kind of coercive top-down dictation of who gets to have sex and who gets to choose. And it's a play which frames that debate right from the start, in terms of fathers and powerful male rulers dictating who humans can fall in love with. And then in the plot set in the wood, in a world of fairies, and Titania is Queen of the Fairies, which is a great job title. She defies her male partner and is punished through sex by being forced to fall in love with a lower class human who is merged with the body of a donkey. And that doesn't. What does happen in your book at that moment? I mean, it feels like the major intervention you make with the story is not just recentering Titania, but also giving us a hot bottom. I never thought I'd say those words out loud on camera. A hot bottom whose relationship with donkeyness feels quite different compared to the Shakespeare play. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we were sort of riffing on, and again, without wanting us as, you know, the authors to say this is what it means when this happens, but I think what we wanted was somehow for the transformation, and we were playing with the idea of what a changeling might mean or be in this universe, and the idea that somehow that transformation represents sort of coming, like being the best version of yourself, or somehow becoming fully in tune with your expression of whatever your desires are. That sort of thing is kind of what we gloss that magic and that transformative act to be.
Yeah, and I think he like other productions of A Midsummer Night's Dream, sometimes Bottom looks amazing, but he's still kind of a joke. And that was also a question, like even we can see that he looks awesome, and what I don't know if you're supposed to read him as someone you would be repulsed by, or if it's just a comic thing. But we thought, well, the act of transformation can be so joyous, and can be, you know, it's not something someone needs to feel like is a sad event to occur to them. So we just wanted to make that transformation, keep the transformation in, and make it positive. And also because we were consciously trying to keep as much of the plot similar as we could in order to try and create an alternative text that could trace its way through, so that you can show the decisions that are made in the original and the decisions that we've come to here, so they can converse. And obviously, if you go wildly off, then that's a different project.
Yeah, like again, the first draft, the Ghost first draft that's all about Titania feels like a different book, because like with Dream, the play, like I think the structure is quite iconic as well as the content of Dream. So to have these different realms and these different sort of social groups that mingle and slot next to each other felt really important to keep as well. I think your point about it being really commonly performed in primary schools is really vital as well, because I think the use of whimsy to cover violence, I guess, is a big thing that's happening there. And so that's why, like, it's definitely not a primary school book that we've done. There's definitely adult content. And I think that's part of the provocation, is to go, actually, if you know, it's whimsical, she loves him, but what does that actually mean? Or actually, you know, she is being punished with sex, not with whimsical, joyous love. How far can we take that? Like, I think a lot of the fun we had in sort of constructing and planning what we were going to do in this book was, can we take something that's technically there in the text that we see, and can we run with that as far as possible? Like, how far can we interpret that for fun?
Yeah, but also disaggregate sex and punishment, right? Sex in the book, in your novel, feels sexy and consensual, and detailed, and it isn't any of those things in the play, I don't think.
Yeah, there's a version of what we're trying to do where, like the inference as we read in the original Dream is that the fairies are kind of sex gods, and they're meddling, but all of their meddling is ultimately, it's for comic purposes, but it's kind of negative meddling. And I think we thought it's a shame, because sex can be so enjoyable and sex can be so sort of ripe with all these opportunities and ways of thinking and living and being. And if you're going to do a whole play or book or a whole piece about the sexual realm, then let's try and make an antidote to that rather kind of gritty version of that side of life, and show the other side of life. And yeah, we've gone one way. There's not a lot of grit in our one, but that's because we're polemically responding, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's grit in the sense of whatever the positive word for confrontational is, it's a text which is confronting the problematic sexual politics of the original. I mean, that notion of an antidote is kind of interesting compared, you know, in a way, that's sort of what the weird flower, magic flower, is in the play and in your novel as well. But it's an antidote from the point of view of people who think they should be allowed to dictate who people fall in love with. And this novel is doing something similar, is revising in a similar way the desires and intent of Shakespeare's play. And in that sense, I think is giving us all kinds of exciting grits.
That's interesting. So if I understand correctly, you're saying that the book is like a flower to Shakespeare's text.
Well, I guess the story is about correcting, intervening in the desires of the characters via the flower, and in a way that this novel is intervening in how Shakespeare in that play think about sex, consent, gender relationships, pleasure. That it's locating and restoring agency, I think, is a point Rose made at the start, finding ways to relocate agency to characters like Titania.
Yeah. Which is fun, because then, you know, we were making this book and it was no longer inevitable that would happen to these female characters. And I suppose if you're staging the play with the text, that the other play text we have is, on some level, you have to deal with the fact, okay, inevitably this is going to happen to this female character, and then you have to deal with and respond to that, which I suppose is something else we're doing. But yeah.
But then when you're going around sort of crossing through things and making adaptation that is for sort of like, maybe you could say the moral good, or for like a philosophy of now, that could feel so dry. We were really concerned to not give an audience a really dry like puritanical version of this play. So we try to really up the comedy and really up the wit, like you could do that with Shakespeare. Like that was the attempt anyway. And I think that's why we went full on with the sex too, is because we just did not want, the last thing we wanted was the accusation that we was kind of sucking the life out of what was otherwise quite dramatic thing. So we tried to go big a lot of the time.
Tried to cram it with as much stuff we enjoyed, as much fun as we could.
You absolutely succeeded. And the sensuality, not just of sex, but of food, particularly around Titania, I think is really striking and exciting. I really enjoyed Bottom saying wow. I think that's a very important word in the novel and not an important word in the play. It's not a play where people ever say wow. They say that they're in a wood and feeling wooed and make really bad jokes about their mental health. But they don't tend to say things like wow, I don't think. I don't know what the Elizabethan equivalent of that word is. But yeah, these characters look around the world around them with great pleasure and excitement, and that is really exciting, I think. You mentioned the structure of the novel and the structure of the play. It feels like the human lovers, on the one hand, are a good place to think about structure and the structural decisions that you made. And on the other hand, the Amazons, who, I mean, I was trying to hang out with the Amazons forever, basically. They were amazing. Could you tell us a bit more about what you did with those two different kind of demographics, those two different bits of the world, and why?
Yeah, why don't I sort of sketch why the Amazons are there first, because that seems like so the Amazons is an example of sort of taking a bit of a provocation that's in the play and running with it as far as we could. So taking the idea that the frame of the play is that Theseus, founder and Duke of Athens, is going to marry Hippolyta, the Queen of the Amazons, like tomorrow or in a few days, whatever. Like that struck me as really, really interesting. And sometimes in the staging, that isn't to the forefront necessarily, because we're in the woods most of the time, wedding at the end. But I thought that's hilarious. Like if the founder and Duke of Athens is getting married to the Queen of the Amazons, that's going to be like the wedding of, that's huge. That's a massive event. Who's invited to that? The gods are coming. We know the gods are there because Titania and Oberon talk about. So that, well, this sounds like a huge phenomenon. So what would be if we extrapolated from that, what would happen? So the Amazons are in a scene in the book where Hippolyta and all the Amazons have a massive hen night the night before, at the same time that Theseus and Oberon are having a whiskey in a club. So I think that came about because of that. Those were the series of questions that we asked ourselves to then have.
And also we had made the decision to go really hard with the Athenian setting. Yeah. And often, at least in the productions I've seen, the Athenian setting, if it's not modern day, is kind of like an English wood. And we didn't, it just, it felt really fun to be in a much hotter spot, also where gods might be resident. And that seemed hilarious. That seemed like a fun way to take the play text at face value and go, oh, right, okay, so perhaps this then or something. And you really up your kind of your quota of how many female characters are in your tale at that point. And again, kind of we went quite big with that and tried to get them super energetic and like people everyone loved. I think partly we were thinking of have you seen The Three Amigos with Steve Martin? Some like I don't know, late 80s, early 90s film, and everyone keeps talking about the baddie. I can't remember his name.
El Guapo.
El Guapo. And through the film, everyone's referring to El Guapo and kind of telling these tales. It's a classic trope of suspense and excitement. And we wanted the Amazons to be built up a bit like that. So when they finally arrive, everyone's kind of like a fan of the Amazons.
And I guess another sort of flip we've done that mirrors the Titania flip is that we've made it so that Hippolyta isn't Theseus's prisoner of war, but that it's or that Athens is at war with the Amazons, but we've sort of changed that to be, what if this is a sort of triumphant alliance of some realms, and what would that mean, and how much fun would everyone be able to have in that kind of world? So that's sort of where the Amazons come from. And I think,
And it's a scene where we were able to write freely from the original play, because it's new, and I think that kind of breathing space kind of shows, and it's at our halfway point in the book, and suddenly we're allowed to, we've given ourselves permission to expand a bit on that world in a new and different way.
Yeah, I love that. And it kind of raises the question as to why there aren't Amazons in the original. It feels like Shakespeare's really missing an opportunity for all kinds of fun there. This is a bit of a detour, so forgive me, but towards the end of his career, Shakespeare obviously writes The Tempest, and there's a really interesting response play to that play called The Sea Voyage, which basically reimagines The Tempest, but with a community of all female islanders, reflecting on the fact that there's hardly any women at all in The Tempest. And it begins with this fantastically kind of Chris Pine Wonder Woman style scene with the Amazons up on the beach congratulating themselves for excluding men from their community because men are rubbish and patriarchy's awful. And then a very, very hot naked sailor washes up and the Amazons all lose their minds over this guy washing up. So it's something that Shakespeare's contemporaries maybe are aware of, is this weird absence in his work of opportunities to celebrate female communities. It's great to see the novel giving time to the Amazons.
And to go back to your other part of the question to do with the cosmos and our versioning of the lovers, I think that came from a deliberate choice, both in that Rose had in her original first draft and that we began with on redrafting, was just a disinterest in including the lovers. And I think it's because kind of like a dream in at least my mind, and I guess many people's, actually kind of centers around this mystery and seductiveness of the fairy kingdom. And it feels, to me at least, like the lovers, whilst they're technically the main plot, are kind of interchangeable and not that interesting, and they're there as a really long plot device. And when I tend to zone out a little bit in productions when the lovers are on as well, and I'm just waiting for the next bit. And it's not because I'm a big fantasy fan or anything like that. It's just like it just feels like it can't compete. And so our challenge to ourselves was to put those names back in the text so it still felt like Dream, but raise the bar of what could be more interesting than a kind of sexy fairy realm. And so we decided to include everything ever and have a conversation with like the smallest micro atom to the edges of the universe, and try and have the cosmos in a kind of, I think some of the influences were like the beginning of Watership Down, that kind of animated sequence, and some things from some comic books. And we just wanted it to be super sumptuous, for it not really to be plot driven, but just to be about creating the feeling of the kind of the world that we were trying to express was possible.
Yeah, and I suppose it's, in terms of it's a riff on the argument Titania and Oberon have at the very beginning, where they argue that the crops are failing and climate change is coming about because they're arguing, and it seemed to make sense that therefore when things are going well, perhaps things respond the opposite feeling. And then again, it felt like, how big a canvas can we sort of make that spread to, which is that the lovers are all, chapters sort of hidden, tucked within the book is this massive sexy space opera where the lovers are reincarnated as celestial bodies. That sort of flirt, I guess, on the biggest scale we can wrap our minds around.
And for us, that sort of becomes the equivalent of the play within the play, rather than the play, which feels like it's very much within the texture of the other storyline. But this is a book within a book within it.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Surprisingly intergalactic lovers, and as you say, I like that way of thinking about it, that they've become the play within the play, a kind of discrete, separate part of the world or worlds of the novel. And that's helpful as well for pointing us towards the next question I was going to ask, which was about the play within the play.
Yes.
So Keir talked about centering this story very deliberately on Athens as a geographical space. And I guess that the play within the play, along with quite a lot of other things in this novel, raise the question of when we are set, you know, what the time of the story?
Yes, that's a good point.
I love a good creative anachronism. I love it. I love shoving everything into the suitcase. That decision came about because when we realized we were taking nothing in the dream text for granted, we started to think, what would the Pyramus and Thisbe equivalent be? Because, you know, what would be a play that has today high stakes in the performing of it, I suppose. So what is a text that is important, or a text that is that
what can be burlesque,
that it matters that someone's putting it on, that you might, you know. And so so that there's sort of two layers of decision. The first is what the text is that the mechanicals are putting on, which is not Pyramus and Thisbe quite. And then also we wanted, again, in a non-kicking down kind of way, I suppose, we thought, well, all the Amdram groups we've ever encountered have been chock full of artistic integrity. Like, there's no reason they need to be kind of bad at what they do. So
it was not interesting. I think
yes.
Something we found with adapting this text is that as soon as we made the same decision as the original, it was not interesting, because then you're just killing time until the next decision.
Mm-hmm.
So we always, like, the rule was, if it ever feels like there's a choice, just go somewhere else. And this was maybe the main example of that was, we can't do Pyramus and Thisbe. Everyone's expecting Pyramus and Thisbe. Everyone's going to be bored as soon as they realize that's what's going to happen. And, you know, sometimes it's not even that fun in the main show to do, depending. And when we wrote the mechanicals, and if they were bad, maybe because in the original they're treated that way sometimes, that was also boring too. So it became a lot more fun to treat these people like they had, with a lot of respect, and for everybody to be proper on it and be making nice artistic decisions. And I suppose that goes with the general thing, was we're trying to give everyone power. We'll give a lot of people power in the novel.
Yeah, and I suppose as well, on stage you can, you know, have brilliant clowning, and the scene's hilarious for that reason, because of performance dynamic that brings in very, you know, brilliant comedians playing someone who's not very good at it. So, like, bad acting done well is really funny. So we didn't have the means to sort of create that kind of response. So it was more interesting to ring a change in the sense of, can we make this a project with some actual artistic integrity for the people involved, and something that hopefully reading it, because it's a play that is important, I think, today, the burlesquing, that the parody and the burlesque becomes in the text of the play they're putting on, rather than how badly they're doing it.
And I think as well, I was so happy when we made the decision for it to be Death of a Salesman. I think the title offers so much. It's so overly serious as a title, as how we think of it in the culture. It seems incredibly about a middle-aged white guy and his concerns, and I'm sure there's loads more in there. I'm not trying to, this is not really a dig at Arthur Miller or anything else, so much as the idea of that overt seriousness and a kind of self-absorption. It was just really fun to kind of like knock away and weave two texts together and talk about that very, like, what seems like quite a modern phenomenon of that of like that introversion around career and sales, and how successful you've got. Felt like a fun splash to put in. In a great big amphitheatre in the middle of ancient Athens, and see what the audience would make of it.
Yeah, there are three kind of really interesting things there for me. One is that Shakespeare and his company are totally showboating with their play within the play, because what they're saying is, look at us brilliant performers perform terrible performers. And so using the terrible performers to kind of, we're fantastic. And instead you guys bring generosity and a fluency in the performance style that you're depicting. So there's a very different relationship between what you're doing and what the characters are doing, I think, compared to the Shakespeare play, which is there basically to critique, I guess.
Maybe we're critiquing the idea of the text more than the performing of it.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, absolutely. There's also something different about I mean, Pyramus and Thisbe, at least as Shakespeare represents it, he just seems to give us endless tableaus of people on their own being sad, whereas Death of a Salesman, particularly as you guys give it to us, is more about, and obviously that play does have things like soliloquies, but as mediated through your novel, it feels like it's much more about a community and togetherness, not necessarily a happy one within the play, but yeah, where Pyramus and Thisbe is all about, you know, I just saw a lion and now I'm freaking out on my own, etc., etc., or I'm on the wrong side of this wall and I want to get to the other side of the wall. It seems there's a shift from solitude to community. And then, yeah, where Pyramus and Thisbe replays Midsummer Night's Dream's obsessions with sex and sexuality, but in a rubbish way. Death of the Salesman seems to be saying things to your novel about gender and class, and in many ways, maybe it's another surrogate Midsummer Night's Dream. It's another, I mean, as Keir was just saying, it's another text to be in a position of opposition to or critique of. I don't know if any of that makes sense.
The community thing is certainly something I hadn't directly thought about.
Yeah, I guess it's like a family drama, isn't it?
Yeah, and so yeah, there is a send up of the dad. There's absolutely a send up of the dad, and that feels always fun to do. And you know, if we're sending up in some ways, Shakespeare, he's like a dad, and you know, it's all the dads. It's just you know, they're sitting ducks really at the moment, in some ways, because of that power held. It's nice to take a cheeky stance on that stuff.
Yeah. And Midsummer Night's Dream is full of wannabe dads as well, isn't it? Like Oberon desperately wanting to parent the changeling, and Theseus going off to bed at the end of the play and having his future offspring blessed by Oberon. There's kind of, there are dads and there are wannabe dads as well, and all kinds of paternity anxiety going on in that play. You mentioned that the novel starts with a first draft by Rose. Would it be all right to talk about the authorship process behind the novel? Tell us a bit more about what it was like to work together and how that worked.
Well, I suppose that the process of this novel was at the point where I had a first draft and I've been thinking about this sort of Titania novel for a bit. I suppose at the point of talking to you about it is, I guess you were just immediately very interested in what this was, ticking a lot of boxes of things you were interested in anyway. And we have worked together before in a theatre context and written together before, so it felt quite smooth to conceptualize that it just was our project.
I think we
quite
both
quickly
got very excited about making the skeleton restructure when we decided that there were certain things that could happen that would kind of make this, perhaps that would improve this draft and be good to look at moving forward. We really went to town on that skeleton structure. And I suspect, mainly perhaps because we're working with an existing text, the structuring had to be pretty full on before it felt like we could go back and tinker with text and make some text in order to have all of our whys and wherewithals set out, because it's so much in dialogue with the other. So many big decisions were made at that stage before we'd composed any of the text that's now in the book. Things like the fact it was going to be salesmen, the fact it was going to be planets, even. We spent a good few weeks on just the skeleton, I think, and we even had like a graphic score almost. We pulled a load of images off the internet of the ways that we wanted to feel in each of the chapters, so that we could really sort of like delve into the writing of it. Yeah, so by the time it came to actual sort of composition of another first draft, basically, we were always very clear on what, sounds like there were no surprises, but we were always very clear on what a scene was going to be, what it was going to do. We were sort of on the same page in terms of our intentions and so on. So it was quite smooth, because we'd already imagined and talked a lot about conceptually where we were. It was quite a smooth, in retrospect, process of drafting, and someone else would look at it and then we would redraft and either make big choices or spend forever agonizing over a word, depending on what was necessary. And some of the final things to go in, apart from the space chapters that actually went in last, but for the rest of it, some of the final things to go in was the dialogue. And that was, it's a bit it can be stunting to be writing dialogue in your novel that is adapting a play, because then you're most on a par with the original text, and there's stakes there, and so a lot of the dialogue, unless the jokes were obvious as we were writing, remained as just X's, and then we'd go back and we'd just try and find the perfect rhythm and the perfect conversation for each of these things. And that felt like a job on its own at some points, is just finishing off and polishing that dialogue.
Yeah, you just, you can't try to out poeticize this guy, you can't try to outwit this guy. He's got a line in dialogue. So it was very much like trying to work out how we could get the book to have its own sort of distinct voice that is in dialogue with this play text, but isn't like a version of it, because then you don't want to do the original but worse.
Yeah, it felt like we had to be a little colloquial. Maybe there are other ways of doing it, but we weren't going to write in iambic pentameter or try and have. I mean, we do poetics in the space chapters, but again, they feel like, for me at least, they feel very different from the poetics we see in the play.
Yeah, I mean, for me, a big part of the magic of a novel is its colloquial manner of telling the reader things, both via narrative and via dialogue, and it seems to marry, no matter how extraordinary and bizarre and surprising and exciting action becomes in a novel, the characters and the narrative voice meets it always with language which makes immediate sense. So there's a kind of interesting divergence all the time, or a tightrope walk happening between moments which should be surprising me, but at the same time being captured in language which really invites me in. And again, that feels like quite a major difference from how Shakespeare might be writing this story.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I think we were trying to have a narrative voice that was fundamentally quite wry, I suppose, because we're describing things that are big or exciting, or if your narrative voice is ever so slightly dry about it, I think you're not quite playing the nose.
I think that's a on the continuum with your work more generally, is that your main character tends to always be your narrator, whether it's first or third or anything else. Mm-hmm. And the narrator always is like creating the humour from what the narrator knows that the characters don't, I think. And, there are other authors that use that technique as well, but I think it's quite particular. It's not always the way that people go. It moves across your work.
Thank you, guys. It's completely fascinating. I'm predictably really excited by the idea that the dialogue went in last. And we might have to get you back sometime to talk about that, because I'd really love to hear how that works. It's really fascinating. We're moving towards the end of...
Oh, sorry. Sometimes it was as much as we'd go, I know it needs to be something big, and then a little question, and then a reply that's this long. And like pace and tempo would kind of lead something.
Yeah, rhythm and structure. I love that. We're moving towards the end of our film. I've got a couple more questions for you, if it's all right, but I want to make sure I say to people watching how wonderful this book is. I've said to you both already that I'm hoping to add it to my teaching at Roehampton University and get my students engaging with it and thinking about its relationship with Shakespeare. But I strongly urge it on our viewers, particularly those who would like to read something which is tackling Shakespeare in both a friendly but also corrective and rewriting kind of a way. It's an extraordinary thing that you've both done. Congratulations. My last question about the book is really about the publisher, and if you might just tell us a little bit more about this publishing venture and where the book sits in it.
Sure. So this is, we put this out under Surface Press, which is, began, I don't know, a year and a half ago or something, as a collective to put out kind of music and video, and we had an eye to this book as well at that time, thinking that might come under the press as well. And so in terms of getting this book made, we sought some funding and kind of patronage from various places, and we're in cahoots with an art gallery in Germany called Die Klein Steinfelder Gallery. That's a new venture, and they've been looking to support our joint work for a while, and this seemed like the project to do that. And then that press has put it out under Bandcamp, which again, like from a musical perspective, DIY music perspective, is where everyone goes. And we had conversations with some authors in advance, asking what like the equivalent would be for books.
Yeah, what Bandcamp for books was, and a lot of people said, "Yeah, we've been wondering that. What's Bandcamp for books?" And after a while, we thought, "Well,
we should use Bandcamp.
We'll try that."
And, you know, try like forever trying to sort of walk the line between being mischievous, but also inclusive. And it felt like a lot of people know the interface. And hopefully people won't mind too much that it's a book, not music, but we are professing that it has punk sensibility, at least.
Great, thank you. Mischievous and inclusive is a good summary, I think, of this work. And then the final question is a question we ask at the end of our films, and I've realised I forgot to warn you about this. So if the answer to the question is none of your business, that's completely fine. But the question is where the word literature sits for you guys, either professionally or personally. It's not a question designed for people to celebrate literature. You know, it's not trying to pressure you into saying good things about it, but born out of a kind of interest in how weird the word actually is and how weirdly it can often sit in our own professional and personal lives. So yeah, would you mind telling us a bit about where it sits for you?
Yeah, we did see on other episodes that you were asking this question. So we did have a think about what it should be. And I think we came up with something that hopefully has something about it, though clearly it's a really interesting and deep question. But we came up with maybe it's books that work, and then the question is what work and on whose behalf. Yeah. But there's
that answer. Sorry. So that last
yeah, but something about the idea of the text at work feels helpful.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Well, thank you again for letting us discuss your book At Work with Shakespeare's play At Work. It's been really joyous hearing more about it. We'll put a link to the book at the bottom of the Lit page, so if you're watching this film, look for further resources and you'll get a link to the book. But thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you. Cheers, Andy.
Cheers.